Hey guys, Mr. E here. We've talked a little bit about the big business era at the turn of the 20th century, and I've mentioned before that the reason that happened was because of politics. So what exactly was going on? What was the politics of the era like that allowed big business to boom so much? That's what we're going to talk about today in Mr. E's classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. The question we're going to take a look at in this video today is, what were politics like at the beginning of the big business era? We need to start off by defining what this era is. What's it called? It's known as the Gilded Age. This term really describes kind of that super affluent society that we had between about 1870 and right around the turn of the 20th century. This was a time of a lot of real great self-indulgence. You saw a lot of really glittery exteriors, but those exteriors were hiding this super corrupt core. There's also this huge gap that started to open up between the rich people and pretty much everybody else. So where exactly does this term, the Gilded Age, come from? Well, it comes from this guy right here. His name is Samuel Clemens. You probably know him a little bit better as Mark Twain. He came up with this phrase when he was writing a book right around the time where he's basically going on about how terrible politics is. I'd mentioned previously about the gap between the rich people and pretty much everybody else who was poor. This income gap really influenced the politics of the Gilded Age. At the top you had the industrialists. These were the super rich people that owned all the businesses, and basically their money is what kept them on top. They typically were Republicans. Remember that Republicans were often considered big business friendly. Well below them was a new emerging group known as the wage earners. At this time, most people were starting to move into cities. When you live in a city or an urban area, your survival is dependent on your paycheck. If you don't have that paycheck for money, you can't survive. You can't buy what you need to survive. These people worked hard for that money, and they would basically do whatever their bosses told them to guarantee that paycheck. So a lot of times these wage earners would also vote Republican because that's what they were told to do. At the very bottom of this group is the farmers, the people that grow food. People that are still living out in the rural areas. They basically farmed to survive. That's how they stayed alive. If they made extra or they produced extra crops that they could sell for money, that's all the better. But number one was about survival. These people typically voted Democrat. They really didn't care about big business. They really cared about survival. During the Gilded Age, we saw this emergence of kind of this new political thing called the political machine. A political machine is basically this really powerful political organization that is in solid control of, well, any number of things. It could be control of a sector of a city. It could be an entire city. It could be an entire state. In fact, here in Tennessee, right around the turn of the 20th century, we had just a massive political machine that ran the state. And to some degree, you could have a political machine that would run an entire country. Luckily for us, we didn't quite reach that stage during the Gilded Age, but we really weren't that far off. A political machine maintained its power a couple of different ways. Number one, they worked and maintained their power through money and bribes. Number two is they typically controlled jobs. People would do whatever they were told because they needed that job to survive. And thirdly, they controlled housing. In these growing cities, housing was a big issue. You needed a place to stay. If you lost your house, things wouldn't really fare very well for you. The person at the top of the political machine was often referred to as the political boss. When we start talking about political bosses, probably the biggest and most well-known political boss of the Gilded Age is this guy right here, William Macy Tweed. Most people just refer to him as Boss Tweed. He was probably one of the most corrupt politicians of the day. Boss Tweed was in charge of a political machine known as Tammany Hall. They operated out of a building called Tammany Hall. They controlled New York City. Tammany Hall really maintained its power by making sure they kept in their pockets the police, the courts, and the newspapers. By controlling these three groups, they had just a very solid hold on New York City. And basically nobody could touch Boss Tweed no matter what they tried. On a little bit of a side note, when we talk about Boss Tweed, we always have to mention this political cartoon right here. This political cartoon goes a long way to really kind of show exactly what Boss Tweed was thinking about most of the time. Can you guess what he has on his mind pretty much all the time? And this is true for just about all political bosses. It really just boiled down to money. How much of it could they get and how much could they stuff in their pockets? Most political machines used two tools to kind of maintain their power. Tool number one is a thing called the graft. A graft comes in one of two ways. Number one, a graft is the illegal use of your political influence for some sort of personal gain. More often than not, that's going to be in the form of some sort of kickback where, say, you get somebody to do a job for you and they give you a little bit of whatever the government pays them. Or it could flat out just be a bribe. Somebody bribes you to make something happen. A graft is also when you use the knowledge you gain from your political position to basically better your bank account. We would call that today having some sort of inside information. The second tool most political machines used was called patronage. Sometimes it's referred to as the spoils system. This is where you basically reward those people that support you politically with some sort of job or political favor. Using these two tools can really have some negative consequences. Let's look at grafts real quick. What kind of consequences could happen if you used a political graft? Well, the biggest thing that happens is probably going to be some sort of scandal. During the Gilded Age, when we talk about scandals caused by using graft, there are two real big ones we need to know about. The first one is a scandal known as the Credit Mobilier scandal. Credit Mobilier was a railroad track construction company that also happened to be owned by the Union Pacific. Now, if you think back, remember that the government gave land to railroad companies to expand, especially to build that first transcontinental railroad. The government also told railroads, hey, if you promise to put a track on this land, we will pay the bill for the construction of that track. Well, some people at the Union Pacific Railroad had this brilliant idea of, hey, if the government's going to give us this land and pay to have us build tracks, what if we also own the construction company that built the tracks? Then we could charge the government way too much money, take all that extra cash and put it in our pockets. And that's exactly what happened. As you can imagine, this really didn't set well with the public when they learned about it, the government spending way too much money on something. When reporters really started to investigate this scandal, they realized over 30 members of Congress were in on this. The second big scandal caused by a graft we need to talk about is the whiskey ring. The whiskey ring scandal revolved around distillers, or people that made alcohol. Basically, distillers all over the country kind of got together and agreed to bribe IRS agents into not collecting nearly as much tax as they should have. This ring of distillers was headed up by a guy named Orville Babcock. Here's where things start to get really bad. Orville Babcock was also President Grant's private secretary. Basically, he worked next to President Grant day in and day out. When word got out that Babcock was kind of leading this group of distillers into cheating the government out of money, people really got upset. President Grant took some serious heat for it, because how could you work next to a person day in and day out and not know what was going on? Using patronage could also have some serious consequences. At the time, during the Gilded Age, patronage was almost second nature. It was being used all over the place, and it got to a point where people almost expected it. Case in point, a guy named Charles Godot, this guy right here, believed that he helped President James Garfield get elected. Godot wrote this speech, albeit an incredibly terrible speech, on behalf of President Grant, and paid to have it published in papers all across the country. In Godot's mind, and we have to keep in mind that Godot was a little bit on the crazy side, in Godot's mind, this speech is the reason President Garfield got elected. Now, that's not true at all, but that's what Godot thought. And he believed since patronage was such a big thing that he deserved something for helping Garfield get elected. In fact, Godot wanted to be an ambassador to the United States. So Godot writes a couple letters to President Garfield saying, "Hey, I helped get you elected, give me an ambassadorship." Garfield basically ignores it because he has no idea who this person is. Well, eventually Godot gets really upset, goes to Washington, finds President Garfield out in public one day and confronts him and basically says, "If you don't give me an ambassadorship, I'm going to shoot you." Well, Garfield has no idea what's going on, so Godot pulls out a pistol and shoots Garfield. Garfield lingered on for a couple of months, but eventually he died because of that gunshot. And it really all was because Godot expected some sort of reward for helping Garfield out. That's how powerful patronage was at the time. Because of this, the government passed a thing called the Pendleton Act in 1883. The Pendleton Act sets up what's called the civil service system. It basically was meant to get rid of patronage. In order to have a government job, you had to prove you were qualified for that job. It's a system we still use today. In fact, in order for me to become a teacher, I had to take a test to prove I could do it. That's what the civil service system is. Alright, let's wrap up this lecture real quick. A couple things you should take away from today's video. Number one, remember that America really looked good on the outside, politically and economically speaking, but on the inside, if you look deeper, we were just a big giant rotten mess. Remember the whole definition of what the Gilded Age is. Number two, remember that political machines ran on a fuel called greed. For most political machines, it was really all about the money. And number three, corruption leads to all sorts of problems. Could be scandals, could be something as bad as even the murder of a president. There you go, ladies and gentlemen, Gilded Age Politics. As always, hopefully you got good notes. Be ready, there's probably going to be a quiz in class when we meet again. Last but not least, remember, guys, don't ever stop trying to learn.